Whitney Sweeney is a PhD scientist, and she works at the UW-Madison, Wisconsin. She is in our Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, which is one of the CTSA awards. UW-Madison, I think, was among the first crop of the CTSAs when they first got funded way back in the, early 2000s maybe, or mid 2000s, and has been consecutively funded ever since. It's headed by Dr. Alan Brazier, who is a renowned researcher, but also a leader in translational science. So Dr. Sweeney has been working with the CAIRIBU Interactions Core in other capacities as well. She has most recently led a 5-month or 5-part workshop series on collaborative science, or what might be called colloquially as team science. And she has really helped us to generate some momentum around that. So without further ado, this is, as I said, the first of 6 Arctic seminars. We created Arctics within CAIRIBU to advance the research capacity of trainees and investigators at early career stages. And it's really kind of a nuts and bolts sort of series. A lot of presentations have been how-tos, how to do this, how to do that. But today we're going to be talking about being collaborative. And as a trainee or early stage investigator, just getting your career going, how can you really start, the ground, hit the ground running in terms of being collaborative minded and already starting to make more and more of your collaboration. So without further ado, Dr. Sweeney, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris, for that lovely introduction. It's awesome to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I pitched this talk, or the inspiration for this talk actually came from experiences in giving workshops. And we had been pilot testing a workshop series predominantly with postdocs, and we were pitching our material for leaders. And we kept hearing, although this is really, really important material for leaders of teams, we kept hearing from the participants, but I'm not leading a team yet. So how can I leverage this, and what can I do with this? And so that was sort of the motivation for designing this material, or pulling this material together. So I'm hearing that we have some early career faculty. I'm hearing we have at least one postdoc. So what I've tried to do throughout the talk is to sort of give you some best practices for leaders, but then also talk about, as a team member or as a more junior trainee, what can you do to make the most of your collaboration? And hopefully, jumping back and forth between those two levels, we can have a great conversation about how to help you and your teams be more effective. Before we do that, I always like to start with thank yous and kudos to my team members, if you will. I want to say thanks to Chris and her team and the Interactions Core for setting this up. They've been terrific to work with. So it's I'm sure you all know them. It's Dr. Chris Peniston, Jennifer Almaraz, who's not here today, and Mariana Coughlin, who's on the call. And then I also like to thank my team here in ICTR. Chris already gave me a terrific introduction of a scientist in the Team Science Core. Dr. Alan Brazier is our executive director of ICTR, but he's also our director of the Team Science Core. And Patrick Kelly is our program manager, and he's been fabulous to collaborate in developing much of this material. So I do like to start out with some ground rules, just, your basics for working in Zoom calls. To, of course, have your microphones off when you're not speaking. If possible, to turn your video on. It does help generate community. I do understand if you're eating lunch or you need a quick screen break, I totally understand. Or even if you're not quite ready for the day, I get it. But if you can turn it on, that would be terrific. I ask that we all try to stay focused and avoid distractions. To have everyone participate, I may call on you, so just be ready. And that no one dominates, and to come with an open mind and to learn from each other. To honor confidentiality, I always say I want you to take the lessons away with you, but maybe if people share individual stories throughout our conversations, you keep those here. To critique ideas and not people, and then of course to take care of self. If you need to take a brief break, feel free to do so. So let's take a minute and talk about this colloquial term of team science. What is it and why do we think it's important? So there's a definition here at the top of the screen that team science is a collaborative effort. So that means you're dealing with at least 2 people, sometimes more, often more, to address a scientific challenge that leverages the strengths and expertise of professionals trained in different fields in an interdependent fashion. So team science is truly interdisciplinary. It's the idea of bringing together diverse perspectives to grapple with, I was going to use the word attack, but that felt very aggressive, attack complex problems that you can't really answer if you don't have these multiple perspectives together on a team. What we know from the science is that team science allows for greater impact, innovation, productivity, and reproducibility. I tend to deal primarily, ICTR is a translational organization, so we tend to focus our work on translational teams, although we work with other teams as well. And these translational teams are there to generate new knowledge with the goal of advancing an interventional product. So it's sort of that bench to bedside, or some have even broadened the metaphor from bench to curbside, depending on how you want to take it. So one of the reasons we're having this workshop is because team science can be challenging. When you bring multiple people together, as many of you have probably, whether it's experienced, whether it's a class activity or a team you're working with now, there's challenges to working with other people. If you have diverse perspectives, especially disciplinary perspectives, that can be very challenging to get on the same page, to truly integrate that knowledge in a way that you can develop and create something new. This is magnified with the size of the team. With these different perspectives, sometimes those goals can be out of alignment. So you might all be studying, say, benign urology, but even within that discipline, you might find that some people are focused on developing a cure. Some people are, a treatment or something. Some people are focused on wanting to educate people. And so they're working towards developing educational materials. Some want to really publish because they're early career investigators and they need to get some publications. So sometimes your priorities and motivations can be out of alignment, even within the vision, which we'll talk about in a minute, of your team or your project. Your boundaries are often permeable. I'm sure you've all been on teams where graduate students, postdocs leave. Sometimes faculty members change universities. Sometimes you have to bring in new people because you're transitioning to a different phase of development in your team. And when you do that, it completely changes the way the team is made up and the way it's thinking and interacting. We know that working across the United States, in interactive international fora, we know that that can also be difficult. I know Chris does a terrific job trying to be mindful of time zones when she sets up meetings. And then the work in these teams is highly interdependent. And again, we've all had that experience where you're waiting for someone or you need someone to join in. So these are the things that make team science difficult. What I'm here to do is to talk about ways in which to overcome these challenges. So from a recent paper from our director, Alan Brazier, he and his co-authors talked about some areas of focus that help high-functioning teams or high-performing teams perform well. These areas of focus, these things that they're doing well, these high-performing teams are doing effective team management. They have a shared vision, they have clear roles and responsibilities, they're really good at managing their project. And those are nuts and bolts things like how often you meet, how you organize your materials. Communication is key. That's a nice next step there is these high-performing teams function well when they have a clear idea of what they're doing, what they're working on, how they're working on it, when they understand who knows what. That's that transactive memory. It's a transactive memory system, is knowing who on the team knows what. So Susie might know how to run the autoclave, I'm making stuff up, and John might know how to analyze the data, et cetera, et cetera. So you know who knows what, and you know how to tap into those and leverage those resources, those intellectual resources. Effective, high-performing teams are strong at collaborative problem solving. And if you'll notice from the subheaders here, this isn't just solving problems. This isn't just troubleshooting. This is also learning and adaptation. This comes into evaluating your team, monitoring your team, and trying to determine what's going well and what needs work. And then, of course, bringing your collective, diverse, intelligent ideas together and solving those problems. We know that high-performing teams have a strong culture, that they're strong in affect, that there's a lot of trust, that there's cohesion, that they feel like they're a team, they feel like they belong, and that they have what we call psychological safety. And I'll talk more about that, but generally psychological safety is when team members feel comfortable bringing their whole self to the team and experimenting with ideas. And then leadership is also important. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about leadership today because I was pitching this for more junior members of the team, but leaders need to manage all of the things above. And then they also have to help make sense of ideas, to resolve conflicts, and to be responsible for setting goals. So it's laying it all out so that we can move in and dive a little deeper into these. So I'm going to talk about the first four in a little more detail, and we'll leave leadership for another day, especially since we have a limited amount of time together. So let's start talking about team management. So I want to talk a little bit about why it's so important for a team or a project to have a clear shared vision. A clear vision provides clarity and communication to the team members. Everybody knows what to focus on and is oriented towards those goals. It provides clarity in roles and responsibilities. All team members should know that what their role is and how it contributes. And it should serve for motivation for the work. I mean, ideally, if you're on a team, you're there because you're interested in contributing to that mission. So if you're a trainee on this team, how can you make the vision work for you? So we're jumping away from being the PI on the team, and we're talking about how can the team members or the trainees make the vision of a team work for them. So what do these individuals need? So every team member needs a collaboration that fits them. They need awareness of the team mission, team vision. I recently changed the language, so we're talking team vision. They have a clear understanding of their roles and responsibilities, and they have clarity about how your work aligns with the team vision. So that's what you need on your team. And that seems fairly straightforward, but sometimes if we're not mindful of it, things can get lost and things can get a little muddied on the team. So how do we get that? So it's important to have a certain amount of self-awareness. So clarify your own interests and your core values. Specifically for trainees, they can work on their IDPs. I know that some universities for early career faculty, they do have things, they might call them something slightly different than an IDP, but they have sort of a career development plan. So really thinking about what you're interested, what your career goals are can help you figure out what team is best for you. So you can either build it if it's your team, or you can find it if you're looking to collaborate with someone else. Speak candidly with all your mentors. I was thinking about this specifically, say, for graduate students and postdocs, that especially for graduate students, I find that graduate students often defer to their mentors, and to a certain extent they should. But I think that the more candid that you can be as a junior member on a team with your mentor, hey, I'm really interested in working on this particular kind of project, I think that can help you find collaborative opportunities that are a good fit and that will ultimately lead to success. If you're starting a new project, meet with the PI or other team members before you join. And then when you're there, of course, to engage fully with team activities. Having worked with trainees before, I've had trainees participate in varying degrees of engagement on different teams. And so the more you engage, the better. And then to ask targeted questions and listen actively. So that vision is really important in guiding the work that you're doing. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump into the next sort of domain, if you will, and that's communication, talking about our shared knowledge and our transactive memory. So thinking about what teams need at this point is to be able to have interdisciplinary conversations to generate, here I'm going to throw out another jargon, these shared mental models. And a shared mental model refers to a shared understanding among team members about important aspects of a team environment. And Establishing these models helps teams to reduce uncertainty, lower misunderstandings, to prevent conflict, to improve coordination and adaptation, and increase effective team functioning. And I love this quote here. It's on the right-hand side of my screen. Teams that perform well hold shared mental models. And they're really important to have these shared understandings. So some of the things that team members need to talk about to develop this, you think about, what do you mean by a shared mental model? What are these ideas that we need to share? Some of it has to do with understanding the nature of the research question, how you're going to address that research question, how to analyze the results. Having a common understanding of that is important. It's also important for more mundane things, like if you have equipment to use, which I'm guessing, in fact, I think I could see Alex's, there looks like there's some equipment back there. Understanding what tools you need. And then if you're collaborating with other team members in other labs, how are you going to share those tools? So that can avoid some conflict if you have a shared agreement, if you will. Again, in terms of execution, what are your strategies and best practices for task performance? So how are you going to do the work you're going to do? How are you going to communicate? I jumped ahead. How are you going to communicate and share documents and data? The composition, this comes to that transactive memory again, understanding the abilities, perspectives, and priorities of all your team members. So what are your team members bringing and how do you leverage that? And then this is a relatively new one that people don't often talk about, which is the temporal shared ideas. So what's the urgency and the timing of the work, and how are you planning to coordinate your work and work towards your deadlines? Understanding how different people work can be really important for team functioning. Even if you think about things like, the worst case scenario, there's some people who are more procrastinators, and maybe they're strategic procrastinators because they know they have a bunch of other things to do and then they get to that other thing late. But other people like to do things right up front. Or, you can all imagine that there's probably a myriad ways that people can approach things in a time-based way, and understanding and agreeing upon how your team's going to do that is really important. So one of the ways that you need to come to a common understanding is to start by dealing with jargon. And I'm guessing that, in fact, I haven't yet heard of anybody who hasn't had to deal with issues of jargon on a team. Sometimes it's just about coming up with a methodology where, you just raise your hand and say, hey, we have a safe environment and I didn't know what you meant by that. And I need to know, otherwise going forward, I'm just going to, it's not going to work for me. So coming up with a mechanism to do that and taking the time to do that is really helpful for a team. It can be really powerful. I know Patrick and I have done that a couple of times. I know there's been one word here where he was like, hey, I don't know what that means. And then I even said, hey, I've never heard that word used in that way. And you have to be able to have that conversation. Otherwise, it's more difficult going forward. Sometimes it can be confusing using common words. So I have here, and I do want to spend a few minutes talking about what your ideas are on research impact. But sometimes common words that we all use, like algorithms, models, I can argue that an engineer and somebody who does animal research are using the word model in a very different way. I trained using animal models of memory. That's a very different model than it would be to have sort of an engineering model, and making sure that you're clear on what you mean by those words is essential. And so here, I always like to ask the question, because I think it's really important. Even I mentioned in the very first slide that team science is important for research impact. Well, what does that mean? And so I'd like for everyone to take a moment and just think about that. And then if you'd be willing to put that in the chat, I'd love to see what your ideas are about what you think research impact is. Number of citations, advances the literature. This is great. I'd like to see the diversity in ideas. So, or the similarity, depending on how it fleshes out. Clinical applicability. Answer to a gap of knowledge and the effect that it has on the community. Okay. Translatable science. Changing policy. Impact on people, changing what or how you research. Excellent. Well, thank you to everybody that provided an example. You'll notice that they're all a little bit different, at least. Some of them are more different. There's more variability than others. But I think that for a team to be able to move forward and to be in alignment, the team needs to be clear on what they're talking about in terms of their research impact. So is there a project where the goal is to change a policy or clinical practice? If that's the case, then everyone on the team needs to be aware of that and they need to be working towards that. Now, sometimes you can have more than one impact. A team doesn't have to only be dedicated to changing policy and clinical practice. And it's up to the leader of the team to help navigate that. So that's also getting to understanding the different people on your team and knowing what's motivating them. That goes back to, are publications most at the top of mind for someone, most important to someone? Is someone wanting to teach? Maybe somebody really wants to influence others' research. Just getting to know that and finding ways to help people have that impact can be incredibly powerful. So thanks again to everybody who shared. What does it mean to you? We didn't talk a lot about how to measure it. But maybe that's a broader discussion for another day. But it also is something else to think about on your team is how you're going to measure that. So in terms of shared mental models, it's not just having the same idea. Sometimes it's operationalizing that idea. So we do have limited time today. So what I did with you is I showed you a very, very brief version of one way that you can simply have that conversation. I actually took this from a workshop. I modified this from a workshop I attended at the National Science of Team Science conference last year. And the workshop was a very simple exercise where you basically put forward a construct like impact. And then you have everybody brainstorm about what their ideas are and compare notes, and then ultimately come up with a common understanding. So I did it very simply in the chat, and we didn't come to a clear understanding amongst ourselves, but you can do something simple like this with your team to get at these ideas. Some other resources that you can tap into for facilitation tools. There's some links to these different resources. So there's brainstorming. This is a link to a brief Miro article about how to conduct good brainstorming sessions. If you want to do something a little more off the wall and a little more creative, check out Liberating Structures. I believe that you have to buy the book, The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures. That's for a cost, but the website has all kinds of small group, large group activities for free, and it walks you through how to do them all. And some of them are very unusual ways to have those kinds of conversations. If you or your students are interested in really just continuing to hone your facilitation skills, we do have a community of practice called Focus on Facilitation, which I actually attend fairly regularly. It can be helpful. Is there an advantage to having things written versus verbal? Ooh, that's a good question, Allison. I actually think there is an advantage to having things written versus just verbal. Now, I'm a little biased and I tend to be a more visual. I'm a doer and I like to see things and work with them. But I also think having things written gives you just a different way to integrate the information. And it also gives you an opportunity to take notes so that you can document them later. One thing I haven't really talked about that much so far is that documentation of your team processes of these shared mental models can be incredibly helpful. Whether it's a team charter, we actually lead people through an activity called a collaboration plan, but documenting these things can be really helpful. It can be helpful for clarifying ideas, and it can also be helpful for onboarding new people so that that's less taxing. Oh, thanks. Lisa's on board with documentations, and Patrick just shared the link to any of you who are interested in considering our collaboration planning activities. And then the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative is another way, and it's another facilitation tool. So these are going to be beyond what I can share with you today, but feel free for those of you that want to check these out for more facilitation. Absolutely, you can check them out. Some of them are pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit about collaborative problem solving. And here I'm going to talk less about the problem solving and more about talking about diversity on your team. And so if you think about an interdisciplinary team, it can be diverse in a number of different ways. I've mentioned disciplinary. I've also mentioned professional and career stage, or at least I've heard professional and career stage. I've heard medical doctors, early career faculty, postdocs, graduate students. But of course, you can also have more demographic variability in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, age, and anything else that could go into that I'm missing on that list. And then personality type. I mentioned the way people work differently in terms of temporal issues, but there's introverts, extroverts, task-oriented, relationship-oriented. And this can sound like it can be difficult to navigate, and it can, but it's also incredibly important for your team. So I do always like to bring up the notion of what we call cognitive diversity. And so what you're looking for in a team is finding individuals that think differently so that they can contribute different kinds of ideas. So cognitive diversity here, it refers to differences in perspective or information processing styles and how individuals engage with uncertain and complex situations. And if you'll notice on this graph from Phillips in 2014, you'll notice that the diverse teams are the blue lines. And you'll notice that diverse teams in terms of productivity, innovation, and problem solving, that they almost always lag behind at first. Can anyone guess why?
Probably takes a while to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, it's right. It takes a while to get everybody on the same page. It takes a while to get to know everybody. But when you put that effort in, then you'll notice that on average, that they outperform more homogeneous teams. So we know that cognitive diversity leads to greater innovation and expedited problem solving, and that tapping into that diversity is often less visible and requires targeted assessment. You need to spend time to get to know your team members in order to leverage these differences. And so it comes down to this iceberg. I'm sure you've all seen this iceberg metaphor, but there's what you see at the top, and then you need to dive deeper to really understand where people are coming from, what's interesting to them, what motivates them, what skills do they have to bring. You know, even things as simple as sometimes you'll find that team members have skills you didn't know about. Like maybe somebody knows how to budget and you didn't know they knew how to budget. Or I'm not sure this was I don't know if this was exciting to Chris, but I know even Chris and I've been working with the interactions core about team science, but I've chimed in a couple of times about summer programs and some other things that she didn't know that I knew how to do because that wasn't necessarily on my, that wasn't part of our agreement when we started working together. And sometimes you can leverage that background that you didn't know was there. So I love this quote from Amy Edmondson in LaTanya Wilkins' book, Leading Below the Surface, hence the iceberg metaphor. Whoever we are, when we are at our best, it's encounters with those who bring different perspectives to our personal and work lives that allow us to grow personally and professionally. And so I also like to talk a little bit about the very first stage of diversity. Diversity is just the first stage. And then in terms of diversity, we also need to have inclusion. And so there was this great metaphor that LaTanya shared in her book. I believe she borrowed it from someone else. But diversity is inviting everyone to the party. So if you think about it in terms of teams, diversity is inviting everyone to participate in the team. Inclusion is being asked to dance, so being asked to contribute. And equity is being part of the planning. And so this is party planning. So diversity is inviting everyone to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, and equity is being on the membership committee. That diversity is having everybody come to the team, having everybody contribute, and having everybody plan and help move the team forward. And there's a great book that was published a couple of years ago by Rushika Tulshian, and she talks about something that's called the inclusion mindset. And it's a fairly straightforward, more of a exercise in mindfulness, if you will, to help be inclusive on your teams. And she calls it the bridge. And it's to be uncomfortable, acknowledge that sometimes that diversity, that cognitive diversity can be uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to, as Brene Brown would say, rumble with ideas. And in order to really get to know each other and understand each other, acknowledging and reflecting on what you don't know. We don't all know everything. And it's important to accept that. Be open to feedback, invite feedback, avoid defensiveness, and have a growth mindset, being open to growing from your mistakes, and expect that all these things take time to change. So I just wanted to put this out there as another way in which, another way to think about things as you're grappling with or embracing the cognitive diversity that's on your teams. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was affect, or your team culture. So talking about trust, cohesion, and psychological safety. So here's a brief survey that I would love for you to just take a few moments and look over. I think I'll just stop. So the SD, it's strongly disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. So take a few minutes and select a team, maybe your current team, and just either mentally or go ahead and document your results, and then we'll come back. So what you're actually measuring is the psychological safety on your team. As I mentioned before, I gave you a very brief description of what psychological safety is. Here's a definition from Amy Edmondson, who popularized the term most recently. So psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And I did have someone in a presentation one time raise their hand and say, doesn't that set the bar pretty low? And I realized, I'm like, actually, yeah, it kind of does. They were very good-natured about it. And so psychological safety, breaches of psychological safety aren't always, actual intimidation and hostile behavior. It can also sometimes just be subtle things like being slightly undermined or in a meeting, not being called on. And so there can be more subtle violations or other subtle things that make a team feel less safe. So I did want to just make that clarification that it's not always doom and gloom. It can also be smaller, subtle things that a lot of us sometimes forget to do occasionally. So it's good to be mindful and to all work on creating the right kind of environment. So psychological safety is incredibly important for teams. There was a relatively recent and very recent paper by Amy Edmondson and Bransbury. It just came out this last month. You'll get all the references with the slides later on if you want to read it. But doing their review of the literature over the last 10 years, they discovered or codified that psychological safety helps get things done, that if you have the right culture in your team, you can unlock individual performance, overcome barriers. It also helps to foster learning. We know that one of the things that most importantly contributes to psychological safety is creating an environment where people can make mistakes. And it's okay that you reframe mistakes as opportunities for growth and learning. And by doing this, you can facilitate your team learning, knowledge sharing, candid communication. And the research does indicate that fosters creativity and innovation. If you think about innovation as an act of rebellion, a positive act of rebellion, because when you're innovating, you're doing something new. You're doing something that you're not already doing. And it takes some bravery and courage to put those ideas out there and to deviate from what's already happening. And so having an environment where experimentation is accepted, even if some of those experiments don't work out, is really critical. This one isn't surprising. Psychological safety improves your work experience. And it also promotes effective leadership. Actually, let's jump ahead. We'll come back to the pizza. Psychological safety is one of the most important things for mediating the advantage seen in diverse teams. You cannot leverage diversity without a psychologically safe team. It just can't happen. And based on some research with Amy Edmondson, she puts forth that the single greatest predictor of team performance is psychological safety. And I've actually been questioned more recently, is that truly the case? And I think the argument we're having here isn't whether or not psychological safety is important. We know that it's important. We know that it's essential for good team functioning. Whether or not it's the most important thing, we can have that argument later. The reason it came up as a question as I was speaking with some graduate trainees, and I think we're all familiar. In fact, I think, Alex, you mentioned that you had great team experiences, but what if you didn't? And we all know of those teams that are out there that thrive, even though they're not really psychologically safe environments. And so then we could be scientific about it and have all those intellectual conversations about how are we defining impact? What do we mean by team performance? But I think the most important question here is, how do we help teams become more psychologically safe? And how do we help people who are in those teams that are not functioning as well as they should be? And so I do like to just take a brief moment and talk about some of the breaches of psychological safety. Here I'm going to use the term uncivil behavior that was put forward by Christine Porath. Actually, there's a link to a TED Talk she gave a while ago on incivil behavior. And so uncivil behavior is overt hostile behavior or more subtle slights. So remember, I talked just briefly, psychological safety, sometimes it's hostility, sometimes it's a subtle thing. What we do know is that it can vary from person to person, and that's another reason why it's important to get to understand each other's perspectives. We know that uncivil behavior can become an emotional contagion. You can imagine if one person's unhappy and they share their unhappiness with other people, that can taint an organization. The statistics that I'm going to share with you were taken from a broad range of disciplines. I will argue that they're primarily business, but there are higher education individuals assessed in here as well. So 98% of employees reported experiencing uncivil behavior at some point. 48 acknowledged that it decreased their work effort or lowered their work quality. 80% lost time worrying about the incident. 78% said that their commitment waned, and 12% left their job. And interestingly enough, I think that can be, I think academia presents an unusual audience, an unusual context. And actually, I brought it up in one of the CAIRIBU sessions, and might have been Nicole, but I can't remember who brought it up, but that academia is one organization in which it's difficult to leave your organization. It can be career changing to leave your organization. So imagine if you're a graduate student, it can be challenging to find a new mentor. Being a postdoc, it can be challenging to find a new mentor. So I think in academia, we find ourselves in somewhat narrow scopes, and it can be difficult to jump ship. So I guess ultimately we need to work on making our cultures better. Christine Porath talks about coping with uncivil behavior, and I do like to put this out here because sometimes students need a little, they need some help in identifying their resources. So we do find that avoidance and confrontation often falls short. 85% of people were dissatisfied with taking these approaches, that they didn't help. So she advocates for coming up with a more holistic approach, and she talks about focusing on cognitive thriving. So accepting feelings, reframing the situation as an opportunity for learning, just trying to let go of negative feelings and focusing on being your best self. And then, of course, affective thriving, which is taking care of yourself and making sure your needs are met, that you're getting enough sleep, you're getting exercise, eating well, and practicing mindfulness. That this is one approach to working on your own thriving can be helpful. But sometimes you need additional resources. So whoever, I forget now who brought it up, but who said that I think it was Alex, you said that talking about psychological safety in your team might be awkward. Sometimes getting that outside facilitator can be helpful. So talking to your grad coordinators, a human resources representative. Here at the UW, we have a number of other resources, broader. We have the Office of Employee Assistance. You can take professional development workshops. And then we have an organization that will intervene if they need to, the UW Ombuds. So I guess what I would say, even though these are UW specific, many of them, is just be aware of your resources. And if you're in a leadership position, make sure that your students are aware of these resources. I'm sure they're not having a disagreement or a conflict with you, but if they ever have a conflict with someone else, you can help them find the resources they need. So we are starting to run out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and just sum up. We talked about the different domains. And I like to think of, here's another jargon term, thinking of teaming as a practice. So I threw a lot of ideas and sort of general strategies at you. And I like to think of working on a team is like yoga. I do yoga sometimes. And I took this quote from a yoga website. It was, "There's many amazing benefits of yoga. It makes us stronger, calmer, happier, healthier, and more flexible. A regular yoga practice allows us to explore parts of ourselves that we might otherwise ignore. It provides a safe space where we can try new things, fail, and try again. It teaches us patience, perseverance, balance, and humility." And if you think about this and modify it just a little bit, even if you're not a yogi and you don't ever want to be, if you think about, there are many amazing benefits of team science training or team science. It makes us more productive, innovative, agile. Regular practice in team science skills allows us to explore parts of our teams that we might otherwise ignore. It provides a psychologically safe space where we can try new things, fail, and try again. It teaches us patience, perseverance, balance, and humility. And so just thinking about, I know I threw a lot at you today, but just thinking about these different domains and thinking about ways in which you can improve upon them for yourself as a team member, for yourself as a leader, for your other team members. And just know that you're not going to change it all today, but it's something you need to work on and practice over time. And so just in summary, if you will, the top 5 ways to make the most of your collaborations: to understand your team vision so that you can align your work, to contribute to a shared understanding of team ideas and processes, to promote psychological safety and thriving for your team, to understand the perspectives and priorities of your team members, to practice your teaming skills to strengthen your collaborations, and to consider participating in one of our collaboration planning interventions if you want to.